In the book that came out, Fear by Bob Woodward, came out yesterday. If you read the preface, the majority of the book blasting and skewering President Trump comes from two sources. Rob the Rat Portman and Gary the Goldman Sachs Weasel. These two were the main sources of this book. Gary the Goldman Sachs Weasel, head of the president's economic team from Goldman Sachs, a Democrat, didn't like the president. How he got the job, I have no earthly idea. Didn't like his policies. This was all about trade, by the way. And Rob the RNC Rat Portman, Rob the Rat and Gary the Weasel. These are the two people that were the main sources of Woodward's book, both disgruntled, both leaving the White House, one getting fired, the other getting ousted. That was Cohn. And by the way, Cohn wanted to be CIA director. Cohn wanted to be chairman of the Fed. Cohn wanted to be CEO of Goldman Sachs. Cohn got none of those. So Rob the Rat and Gary the Weasel, these are the sources for Bob Woodward. And then they have the audacity to come out with a statement yesterday saying that, well, they were taken out of context and they didn't really mean that. And it's not really presented the right way. And their words were twisted. Oh, really? Hey, Gary the Rat, Gary the Weasel, and Rob the Rat, guess what? Woodward says he has 400 hours of tape on you guys. 400 hours or something like that. Hours and hours and hours of tapes where you had no problem admitting that you would go into the president's office and hide papers or take them off his desk so he couldn't sign them. You had no problem admitting that to Bob Woodward in hours of testimony, Rob the Rat and Gary the Weasel. These are just, and then why don't you have the guts to come out and take ownership of and say, yes, we took papers off his desk. Yes, we don't like him. Yes, we think he's a disaster. No, they have to come out with a statement and say, well, we were taken out of text. We didn't really mean that. We were not presented in the right way. What a bunch of yellow-bellied, gutless creeps. Rob the Rat and Gary the Weasel. All you have to do is read the preface. I just got the book. I read the preface. I couldn't believe it. I read the prologue. That's it. I didn't get further than that. I was so infuriated. Just the prologue. You know what this whole thing is about? Trade. This whole thing is about trade. This is what I have been telling you for 8 years on the air. This is the swamp. This is Goldman Sachs running the country. You're not supposed to come in and mess with Goldman Sachs's or Manhattan's money. They run the country. Workers are just a commodity to be exploited. Trump came in and actually wanted to stop trade deficits. And this infuriated Rob the Rat and Gary the Weasel and others in the swamp who make billions of dollars off of free and open trade and open borders. And this whole thing is about trade. All the documents they took off his desk and manipulated, these weren't tax cut documents or documents on what our foreign policy is in Afghanistan or things of that nature. This was all trade. They were aghast that the president wanted answers on the Korean trade agreement because we had a $20 billion trade deficit and they were dumping. And the Chinese were dumping products and services in our country and putting our manufacturing and workers out of jobs. But Gary, the Weasel from Goldman Sachs, oh, he's got a bigger picture here. He's got to protect the interest of his company. He's got to protect the interest of his big money billionaire friends in Lower Manhattan that depend on open borders and open trade and cheap goods in order to drive their bonuses. These people are turtle turds. This is all about trade. It's unbelievable. It's what I've been saying for 8 years. The whole system in this country is rigged. Elections before Trump were a karaoke dance. Oh, you got Clinton and Bush and Gore and Bush and Kerry and Bush. It's all nonsense. They have a debate. Doesn't matter who wins. You know who wins? Goldman Sachs. You know who loses? American workers. The system has been rigged. The swamp is set to protect the elites in a perpetual manner. Trump came in and threatened it. Trump asked questions. Trump understood that the system, the U.S. governmental system led by Goldman Sachs, was set up for one thing, and that was to perpetuate the elites making more and more money at the expense of the U.S. working man and women of this country, because they're just viewed as commodities. And if you can have open borders and bring more workers in and bring in cheap labor and depress wages, Gary Cohn's buddies on Goldman Sachs are going to make not a $50 million bonus, it's going to be a $100 million bonus. Or $200 million. Or $10 million. Or whatever it is that these people make at the expense of U.S. workers. And now let's get to Goldman Sachs. So Goldman Sachs has a hotline. The Goldman Sachs fraud hotline for top executives. If they see anything out of order, they should call this hotline because they should be a whistleblower. So Goldman Sachs has a whistleblower hotline. So any executive or anybody at Goldman Sachs is supposed to call this hotline if they see any evidence of fraud or ethics concerns. So it's the Goldman Sachs whistleblower hotline, which they publicize. We have a hotline for all of our employees to call up if they see anything that might be ethically challenging. They have a hotline. So a top Goldman Sachs banker called the whistleblower hotline with ethics concerns. Now, his bosses, including the incoming chief executive, told him, let the complaints go. It doesn't matter. James Katzman, a Goldman Sachs partner and leader of West Coast mergers and acquisitions, called Goldman Sachs' whistleblower hotline in 2014 to complain about ethics violations of his company, because that's why the hotline was set up. He said Goldman Sachs is hiring customers' children. He said Goldman Sachs executives are sharing customers' personal information for financial gain for the company. Instead of investigating this, as you're supposed to do, when you get a call to your whistleblower hotline, guess what happened? Goldman Sachs executives, including incoming CEO David Solomon, guess what they did? They told Katzman to forget about it. We don't really investigate these things. You don't understand, Mr. Katzman. We just need to put this hotline out there for the public. It's like a PR stunt, but we never really call it. And if you do call it, that's really a problem for us. So you really shouldn't be calling this number. Like, don't call it again. And those complaints that you have, well, we're just going to turn it over to lawyers and never to be heard from again. That's their hotline. Sweep it under the rug. Katzman leaves the company and he had to sign a document not to tell anyone. We don't know why he left the company, but you can just imagine. Here's our whistleblower hotline, Goldman Sachs. We're the new ethical company in New York City, and here's our whistleblower hotline. Look for all the world to see. But if you call it, you're going to leave the company. We're going to run you out, and you're not supposed to call it. You're just supposed to say that we have it, dummy. Unbelievable.